On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Robert Bland, Assistant Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Tennessee. Dr. Bland's research focuses on the late 19th and early 20th century United States, with an emphasis on the African American experience and the postbellum South. His research and teaching engages questions of racial formation, electoral and cultural politics, and battles over historical memory. His latest book, Requiem for Reconstruction, Black Counter-Memory and the Legacy of the Low Country's Lost Political Generation, examines the legacy of Reconstruction in the African American public sphere. It explores the efforts of Black South Carolinians and their Northern allies to preserve the last bastion of radical republicanism in the South during the half-century that followed the Compromise of 1877. In doing so, he illuminates a series of connections between grassroots struggles in the South Carolina Lowcountry over political patronage, disaster relief, local schools, and the representations of Gullah folklore, and the simultaneous debate in the national Black press over how to contest the cultural and intellectual dimensions of the emerging Jim Crow order. His research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. At University of Tennessee, he teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses on African American history, the U.S. South, and the craft of social and cultural history. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Robert Bland, Assistant Professor of U.S. Cultural History at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. How are you doing today, Dr. Bland?
I'm doing well, Dr. Newby. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be able to talk with you today. And I'm excited to talk both about Black studies and about your new book, Requiem for Reconstruction. So let's dive in. So how did you get into Black studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to doing the work of Black studies?
All right. Now, that's a great question. Some of it is biographical, and some of it is the specific kind of institutions of undergraduate and graduate training that I received.
Okay.
So I always grew up in a household where the Black past was a formal presence, where you kind of had to understand history. I was a child of two graduates of HBCUs. My mother graduated from Florida A&M University. My father did an MBA at Atlanta University. And so this shift in the post-civil rights generation, they had both grown up in the Jim Crow South. They both were the children of World War II veterans. My mother's father drove in the Tallahassee bus boycotts. My father's grandfather had served in World War I, had participated in the Harlem Renaissance. And so there's some family story that kind of appears as lore and as mystery, as kind of a world of the Jim Crow era that was fading away. And there was also the kind of specific networks and ideas that were produced in the post-civil rights era. My parents had spent time in Black Chicago in the 80s, and this was a world of Harold Washington, of Louis Farrakhan, of Trinity Church, Michael Jordan kind of emerging as a cultural phenomenon, Oprah Winfrey emerging as a cultural phenomenon. And so there's always a kind of a deep sense of that you need to understand the past, and there were Black books, and kind of history is always in the household. I also grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which had its very specific cultural milieu around Black history and the Black past. It's a region that has two historically Black colleges and universities, Hampton and Norfolk State. I was kind of surrounded by kind of the world of Black ideas. On my cul-de-sac, there was a kind of historian of African-American history, a professor of Black psychology, Michael and Janice Hucles, who kind of, you literally go down the street and you're getting kind of some of this Black past story. Growing up in the Tidewater area, you get the history of the 1619 origin of Fort Monroe and emancipation, a story of the Jim Crow Black South, and the kind of way that kind of the historian Earl Lewis magisterially captures that specific world in his book In Their Own Interests. This is a world that also had a kind of very specific Sunbelt conservatism. This is Regent University and Pat Robertson. This is a world that kind of emerges. Virginia Beach is a city that kind of emerges because of massive resistance to the desegregation of public schools in Norfolk and kind of white flight that kind of creates this Sunbelt city. And it's also a world that's kind of this hub of a reverse Great Migration. So in the same way we understand the stories of Atlanta, of Charlotte. Virginia Beach is very much a place where many Black Americans from across the Northeast are returning and building homes, seeking jobs in the kind of Navy and the shipbuilding industry and healthcare industries. There's a web, again, of Hampton and Norfolk State alums. And so out of this firmament, you get this very specific cultural world, right? Before you have Freaknik in Atlanta, you have Greek Fest in Virginia Beach. You have a kind of AfRAM Fest, African American cultural festivals that are happening in Virginia Beach. This is a world where you're seeing kind of the rise of sports stars like Allen Iverson and Michael Vick, who are pushing up against kind of more conservative sports leagues at that time, of the NBA and NFL, and kind of bringing a very specific Blackness and bringing Blackness into kind of a larger cultural discourse. And it's also, right, when you think about hip hop, you can think about Pharrell Williams, Missy Elliott, Timbaland. And so this is a moment where kind of a broader Southern kind of Black South energy is entering kind of the national conversation, but the place I'm growing up in, Virginia Beach, is adding to those conversations. And it's giving kind of a certain consciousness, right? You're aware of the kind of wheel of culture turning in very specific ways. Finally, I am a product of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Network. And so that's a world that introduces you to a broad network of Black study, a broad sense of um, what the academy could be, not only from the perspective of the formal disciplines of places like history and English, but many of my friends were scholars who went into Black studies, ethnic studies, Africana studies, Black diasporic studies departments. And so those conversations that you're having at the undergraduate level and the graduate level are all shaping a broader sense of what Black study could be.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that. So your upbringing and early education, all of that definitely, you said it was immersed in like this understanding of Black past and Black history and the traditions, and the things that had happened, like just Blackness in general, which really made me think about the framing of your book as Black counter memory. So I wanted to follow up on what you said about your upbringing and how you came to Black studies and ask how did that influence the idea of counter memory, right? And thinking about um, its importance in really thinking back and recounting Black pasts.
Right, right. That's a great question. I Because of where I grew up and because of the specific sensibility of the place, the way that you could feel the wheels of history turning, it gave me a sense of the texture of Black institution building. And
Mhm.
so my work around counter memory is really rooted in these not only people and places, but the institutions that Black Americans built after the Civil War and during the Jim Crow era to preserve a specific set of archives, to preserve a specific set of historical storytelling, but also a specific set of epistemologies, right? A specific set of knowledges, all right? Obviously, we have a kind of rich historiography. We've got a rich tradition of Black scholarship that's turned their attention to Black placemaking and Black idea production, Black intellectual history. My work tries to add to that tradition, right? One of the questions you asked in that initial question, what keeps me grounded? And it's that sense of tradition, right? The kind of Woodsonian tradition, the Du Boisian tradition, these institutions that serve as anchors in troubling times, right? The um, HBCU, the Black church, the Black secondary school. Um, a lot of this specific project comes out of an experience where I taught high school social studies at a public school in Jackson, Mississippi, Jim Hill High School. And Jim Hill is named after James Hill, the last Black man to serve in the Mississippi state legislature before Jim Crow. And right, you don't see that often, right? You see public schools named after Booker T. Washington and other more famous, prominent 20th century figures, but the idea that there's a 19th century political figure who has a public school named after Richard Wright, right, kind of attends this school, right? There's a rich and robust historical tradition there, right? Seeing and being attuned to that type of historical storytelling, that counter memory. Um, I have to kind of think through and kind of confront those specific types of stories to tell my story. I had to understand both where I came from, but using the lens of my own biography in some ways to see, right, the ways that that's a broader story.
Thank you. So, building on that, right? You are a historian, um, but you do a particular type of history. You are focused on uh, Blackness and Black people and the counter memories and telling a different story about time periods and eras of Blackness. So, how do you situate yourself as a historian in relationship to the disciplines given the type of work that you do? And I guess also as a teacher, because you said you were teaching at a high school. So that's a whole nother lens then that comes in, I'm sure, in the work that you do now.
Right. That's a great question, and I see the kind of University of Maryland backdrop, and I did my graduate training at the University of Maryland. They would take seriously a very specific social historical tradition. This is where you see the rise of the Freedmen and Southern Society Project. This is the house that Ira Berlin and Leslie Rowland and Elsa Barkley Brown built, and it's very formally historical, right? The training that I received emphasized history as a hermetically sealed world. And yet, we also have a rich women and gender studies PhD program at the University of Maryland, rich American studies program, rich African American history, African American studies department at Maryland. So while you're learning African American history through the lens of history at Maryland, um, a lot of my best friends in graduate school were also doing more interdisciplinary work. And thinking about those conversations between this very specific historiographical and disciplinary battles to shape the field of American slavery, and mastering those was a full-time task. But as I move forward with my own intellectual journey, think about the disciplinary bounds in history, right? The questions of the archive and work of someone like Sadi Hartman, thinking about Black geographies and the work of Clyde Woods or Catherine McKittrick, and also thinking about broader questions of memory with Michelle Wolf Triol and Silencing the Past. I sought to bring together, right, those worlds of history, those worlds of Black study. Um, I seek to bring them to the fore in the undergraduate classroom and the graduate classroom. And when I was a secondary teacher, I also sought to speak to um, the specific concerns that my students had that were kind of rooted in a Black sociology of a specific place. And so I think the best version of Black study not only brings a scholarly focus to kind of these questions, but it also takes seriously the worlds where these institutions sit.
Thank you. Um, so building on that, right? You mentioned the ways in which, as a secondary teacher, the concerns of your students' lives were important to you, and really thinking about how we bring Black studies in to speak to that. So, how do you see your work as a teacher or the pedagogical work that you do, both then and now, as informed by Black studies?
Right. So I'll go back to the secondary school example where I was teaching in Jackson, Mississippi. Demographically, the blackest metro area in the United States, a place that embodied, right, the um, many of the shifts of the 20th century, right, the hub of the Jim Crow regime and the subsequent disinvestment that regime kind of enacted, the specific types of violence that we understand as happening in Mississippi, but also the specific gifts, whether that's kind of going into the Delta and understanding the blues, understanding Jackson as the specific hub of the Black freedom struggle. And then in the post-civil rights era, this is what Kiese Layman's kind of own work has really highlighted, right? The work that places like Jackson State have done, the work that Margaret Walker has done to kind of illuminate this specific type of post-civil rights story. And we understand uh, the various ways that uh, these Black cities in the post-civil rights era give rise to a new political class, address specific questions around white flight, about Black middle class advancement, and also, um, for lack of a better term, right, the production of a underclass, right, the kind of very specific ways that uh, racial capitalism um, exacerbated wealth gaps, um, enacted policies of mass incarceration, created food deserts. And my students grew up in that world, right? When I was teaching in Jackson, Mississippi. And so understanding the specific ways that my students encountered uh, anti Blackness, but also the ways that they inherited a rich tradition that help them see and kind of confront and challenge that world, right? And when I think about the kind of best work in Black South studies, right, it takes those two tensions and brings them together, um, and uses that to not only create scholarship that articulates those visions, the kind of highest frequency of Black studies, but it also captures um, something that people can use in their own lives, kind of in a way to tell the stories of their communities.
Thank you. So that makes me want to ask you, um, like, so you do that in Requiem for Reconstruction, um, and really thinking about how the more common or broader story that's told about Reconstruction is about it as a failure, and all of the negative things that came out of that time period. But there were people who did a lot of important work. There was resilience and agency that happened during that time period, and that story is not told as often enough, and those names are not known in the same ways that the names of people post uh, the Reconstruction era are known in terms of thinking about the Black past and Black history. So, what are some of the things that you think we can learn from that time period? Or what are, I guess, maybe the main takeaways that you think are most important from the book that we can apply to our contemporary situation and really thinking about the strategies, the resiliency, the agency that can be applicable to us today?
Right, right. I think that's a critical question, and maybe it's the central question for scholars of the Reconstruction era. In many ways, Reconstruction serves as a grammar for modern African American history, and for those historians who find themselves engaged in the study of Reconstruction, you end up going back to Du Bois and the
Mhm.
specific Du Boisian critique of the discipline of academic history, of American academic history, the critique of the Dunning School. And so most of us are familiar with the propaganda of history, that last chapter of Black Reconstruction, where Du Bois really eviscerates the American historical profession for offering falsehoods and the myth of the lost cause as a substitute for history. And yet, right, the Du Bois that we understand, the kind of text of Black Reconstruction, erases a generation of history. It erases a generation of Black intellectual production of a past of Reconstruction. And so Requiem for Reconstruction really tries to recover, capture, and articulate those figures who understood the importance of Reconstruction, understood the figures who not only established Reconstruction era governments and built political parties, but also wrote histories, not formal, peer-reviewed academic histories necessarily, but in the Black press, right? In local lyceums and literary societies, um, in monographs um, written at the various moments in the late 19th century that tried to highlight the work of Reconstruction era leaders. And so I think we can take those histories as we enter the 250th anniversary of the United States. We're also encountering the 150th anniversary of the election of 1876 that we often use as a kind of stand in for the end of Reconstruction. And think about the first founding, the 1776 moment, in conversation with the second founding, right? The immediate Reconstruction era genesis, and put those in conversation with each other. And why do we have a rich architecture to kind of think about the nation's um, origin and the Constitution and the Revolutionary War, but struggle with a public history of Reconstruction. And how do we think about the end of Reconstruction, right? A generation of scholars have told us we should not overemphasize 1876 as a kind of Reconstruction ending point, right? We need to go up into the 1880s. We need to go up into the 1890s. Think about the Wilmington Massacre. Think about these various state constitutions that disfranchised Black voters in the 1890s, but also think about the ways that um, Black Americans, both in the South, in the North, in places like Washington, D.C., New York City, continued to ring the bell about Black political power. They continued to rub shoulders with Black political leaders. So Black figures like Robert Smalls continued to serve in the House of Representatives well into the 1880s. So how might we reconsider the periodization of Reconstruction, but also the basic storytelling of American history through the story of Reconstruction?
Thank you. So, building on that, what interests you most about the past of the field of Black studies in both critical and excited senses?
Right. I'll give you three answers here, right? In the deepest sense, I'm interested in that Woodsonian moment, right? The struggle to build a Sala in the Journal of Negro History, um, Woodson's relationship with other scholars, often contentious relationship with other scholars of Black life, but also the relationships he built with people like Monroe Work, the noted Black sociologist who appears in my work as a archiver of Reconstruction era memory, um, going around collecting letters, trying to build documents to archive this Reconstruction era past, and that ends up in these early issues of the Journal of Negro History. And so, thinking about this kind of initial formal creation of Black study and kind of how have we lost some of these accounting methods, how have we um, missed some of the story, but also what are the stories that we return to when we think about Carter G. Woodson, um,
Mhm.
and especially considering our earlier part of the conversation, the networks that Woodson builds with secondary school teachers. This is Jarvis Givens and his work, Fugitive Pedagogy, and this relationship between the academy, and here we're talking about kind of Black institutions of higher education, and secondary schools and primary schools, and what are those networks, and how might we understand um, these broader intellectual worlds that were being established in the Jim Crow era. I'm interested in a middle range deep history, that 1960s world of Black studies, institution building, those various programs of Black study that were produced because students took over buildings. They demanded administrators add Black studies at a moment where Black power was at its apex. I am currently at a Research One university in the American South that has a Black studies program that was established at that moment. And we are currently in a moment where many of these programs are under duress, where kind of state legislatures are visibly and openly attacking the project of Black study in places like the American South. They're especially under pressure. And how might we go back to those moments where, again, um, I understand historical reversal, but I also understand historical progress. And the 1960s was a moment where people had to fight for these institutions. Black studies was not a self-evident, self-perpetuating project. And so, how, in the midst of the kind of conservative backlash and J. Edgar Hoover and COINTELPRO monitoring, did people build and sustain those Black studies programs? I think that's something that, as a historical and kind of intellectual project, thinking about that moment. And just more recently, in terms of the last generation or so, the scholars who are confronting and debating questions of emancipation. Right? And here I'm thinking about Sadia Hartman, whose works, Scenes of Subjection, is really a cornerstone of modern Black study. And she's got a very deep criticism of emphasis on emancipation, going so far as to say emancipation was a non event. I come out of a scholarly tradition that says no, emancipation was a monumental event, it was a colossal event. And the kind of the dialectic between those two poles of Black study, right? Emphasis of 19th century historical epoch making around emancipation, and the kind of Afro-pessimistic tradition that challenges that. And thinking along those poles has been really generative for my own work.
Thank you. So then, what interests and excites you most about the future? Or even right? Where should the future of Black studies go, or what questions should we be asking given our current moment?
So first, I would identify, right, a return to the Black South studies. I think there's a really rich cohort of scholars who are returning to the Black South, taking seriously figures who we might have previously understood as conservative, as accommodationist. Here I'm thinking of work around Booker T. Washington, um, Jarvis McInnes's work, The Afterlives of the Plantation comes to mind, but also, right, this is engages with the kind of broader world of folks working on Black geographies and the ways that Black Southerners are thinking about land ownership, thinking about institution building. Um, some of this is work that engages with the Black freedom struggle, both the immediate post World War II, but also long Black freedom struggles that you can tie back to the interwar period, but also the world of scholars that are also turning the Black South questions to the 19th century. And here I'll also tag a wave of scholars thinking about racial capitalism, and I think that's been a really generative field around slavery and racial capitalism. Justin Leroy has a work that's coming out that's going to do a long history of 19th century Black economic thought that I think is going to be really important for scholars of racial capitalism. And also Justine Hill Edwards' recent book on the Freedmen's Bank, I think is a really a model for thinking about racial capitalism in the 19th century. And I'm deeply interested in and fascinated with these scholars who are bringing about these questions of dispossession, of land ownership, of banking. I think that's a kind of site that's going to continue to be really rich for future generations of Black study scholars.
Thank you. So is there anything you want to add, elaborate on, expand on, um, or a question that I didn't get to?
I think we are in a moment right now where a generation of Black political progress and also um, Black study, Black intellectual progress feels under duress. And on the one hand, we've seen this before, right?
Mhm.
We are in danger of understanding the American past as moving in a Whiggish liberal direction, and Black studies always is cautioned against that, right? The Black studies tradition has, at its most critical in the best sense, kind
Mhm.
of cautioned us against understanding the American project as um, offering um, a moral arc that bends towards justice, right? Kind of scholars of Black studies have challenged us to think deeply about the ways that that broader myth is can be challenged by factual evidence. By um, we have scholars in the social studies who can measure Black outcomes, mortality rates, maternal death rates of the Black wealth gap. Scholars in the humanistic tradition who are understanding histories of Reconstruction, histories of slavery, um, histories of racial inequality broadly, but also I think the history of Reconstruction highlights the ways that Black progress can be undermined, it can be reversed, and yet the story that I tell in my work, the story of the Reconstruction generation, is a story of Black agency in the deepest sense, right? The confrontation with white supremacy, the confrontation with an apathetic state, a moment where empire is resurgent, a moment where the racial wealth gap is widening, a moment where racial violence is at its apex, right? We kind of see the 1890s as a high water mark of lynching. And through that, figures like Robert Smalls, figures like Ida B. Wells, as well as lesser known figures like William J. Whipper, Francis Rollin, um, John Edward Bruce, are documenting a history that will provide the spiritual, intellectual, and cultural engine for the modern Black freedom struggle. And so, not that history has to always be usable and that it has to provide us with a sense of what to do next or what to do now, but I do think that thinking through the questions of Reconstruction for scholars of Black studies can both serve that critical purpose, right? Think about the myths that um, lead us to asking the wrong questions or approaching politics in the kind of wrong ways, thinking about humanistic dead ends in our own scholarship, but also as we search for meaning and how to understand public history, how to think about teaching, how to think about how to organize community and build flourishing Black social life in the uh, current moment. I hope that we continue to return to Reconstruction, we continue to return to Black studies broadly, and return to some of these questions that the figures that the Reconstruction generation asked in the late 19th century.
Thank you. I think that that is a wonderful point to end on. So, thank you so, so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. And for this book, I think it is very important in returning to those questions that um, Black people were asking during Reconstruction, through the end of Reconstruction, whether we ended it 1876 or think about it as continuing longer and what the implications of that are. Um, I think it's particularly important right now because, as you said, like it's the things that are happening right now are not necessarily new. And so seeing the agency, the strategies, the production that came out of similar times in the past, I think is super important in this moment. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the generative questions that we were able to kind of make time and space to have this conversation, and wishing you all the best as you kind of do the important work of sharing Black studies with the larger public.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great one.